Welcome to the meeting today. It's really an excellent occasion to remember the Battle of Stalingrad, the victory of the Soviet Union, which turned the tide on the Nazi Fascists. 70 years ago, the Nazi Fascists were trying to attack Stalingrad and seize it and stop things, but in fact, the Soviet Union turned the tables and sent them packing. General Paulus surrendered. And Harpal will give you the proper details of all these things, because one of the jobs that Stalin Society has to do is to make sure that history is not rewritten in the way that so much falsification takes place now. And I'm sure Harpal will give you a good justification for what actually.
Thank you very much. Comrade Chairman and comrades and friends, welcome to this meeting. Coming February the 2nd, marks the 70th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet Union at the Battle of Stalingrad against the Nazi Fascists, which the chairman has already remarked turned the tables not only on the Nazis but actually changed the whole course of war, and I should say changed the whole course of historical development all over the world. I'm not a military historian. A proper person who had knowledge of military affairs and was a military historian would have a large map here and a long stick to point out which battle took place when and how the forces moved. And since I'm not competent to do that, I shall avoid that. I'm going to give you the political as well as the military flavor of that titanic struggle when the fate of the world literally hung in balance, and the role played by the Soviet Union in turning the tide against the forces of reaction, imperialism, and fascism. Ever since the Soviet Union collapsed 20 years ago, every attempt is made to falsify Soviet history, to belittle the role of Soviet Union in defeating fascism, and by comparison exaggerating the role of semi-fascist elements like Churchill and others as being the great anti-fascist fighters. And it is the job of Stalin Society, as indeed of my own organization, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists, to actually fight against that falsification of history. Falsification of history is by no means new. It's very old. Engels, in his unfinished history of Ireland, had the occasion to remark this. And these remarks of Engels continue to be valid today as they were at the time when he wrote it more than 150 years ago. He said, "The bourgeoisie turns everything into a commodity, hence also the writing of history. It's a part of its being, of its condition for existence, to falsify all goods. It falsified the writing of history, and the best paid historiography is that which is best falsified for the purposes of the bourgeoisie." So the best paid historians, they're not really even historians, they're charlatans. They're paid mercenaries of imperialism. People like Robert Conquest, people like Anthony Beaver, people like Solzhenitsyn, etc., who falsify history in the interest of bourgeoisie. And writing third-class books, they sell in millions. They become the best selling authors and make a lot of money. But in the process, they've sold their soul because they're falsifying history and they're falsifying the development of thought as well as the development of historical movement, if you like. So that it's not lost in the translation, so that you are not simply immersed in the details of the Battle of Stalingrad. I want to actually start by simply naming and not explaining too much the very important factors that led to the victory of the Soviet Union. Because everybody was expecting, when the Soviet Union was attacked by the Nazis on 22nd of June 1941, that she would not last more than 6 weeks. The Germans were supposed to be invincible. They had a perfect military machine. That military machine had been used for a period of 2 years. German army had acquired some fighting experience, and they'd been building for that war for a number of years, aided by Anglo-American imperialism, who we are now told were the great anti-fascist fighters. Their attempt all along had been to actually embroil the Soviet Union in a war with Nazi Germany, hoping that the two will exhaust each other. Then in the interest of peace, the French, the British, and the Americans would come and say, no, boys, like boys fighting at school, you don't do that. And of course, overpower both of them, rival imperialists, the Germans, and of course, the much-hated communists from the Soviet Union. That had been their plan. That plan had been defeated by Soviet diplomacy and Soviet armed preparations for the war if you like. But there were 5 factors which actually led to the victory of the Soviet Union. They are very important to remember. First one was the elimination of the 5th column in the Soviet Union. Stalin and the Soviet Union have been much condemned for the Moscow trials and for the trial of some military officials, generals, including General Tukhachevsky, saying Stalin was conducting some vendetta, and in doing so, he had eliminated the leadership of the Communist Party and the leadership of the Soviet military. Far from it. In fact, when the war started, writers such as Joseph Davis, who was the American ambassador in Moscow, completely agreed that what had taken place was that the Soviet Union had eliminated the kind of 5th column which in other countries like Norway and France facilitated the victory and the entry of German fascists. When, therefore, that 5th column wasn't there, there was nobody to assist. This is not to say that there were no forces in the Soviet Union who did not commit treachery against their motherland. There were, but they were so minor that they could not have a decisive influence. In France, for example, half the bourgeoisie simply opened the door of France to the Nazis and went on to establish the Vichy Republic, which was anti-Semite, which was anti-communist, which was pro-imperialist, which was pro-fascist. And the French bourgeoisie, up to today, are embarrassed. They don't talk about it. The role of the French bourgeoisie in the Second World War is not much talked about. The French partisans, led by the Communist Party, fought heroic battles against the fascists, but it wasn't the French bourgeoisie. Only minor sections of it did that. So the Soviet Union had eliminated the fifth column. That was not to be there to help the Nazis. Secondly, it was socialism which actually played the greatest role in the victory of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had, through socialist construction, industrial construction, and through collectivization, built up Soviet strength, economic strength, without which it would have been impossible to win the war. In 1931, Stalin was speaking to a conference of leading personnel of Soviet socialist industry on the 4th of February 1931. He was asked the question, we are going at such a rate of industrial development. It's tiring people. Can we not slow down the tempo? He went on to answer that question, which had been raised again and again. He said, you know, the imperialists only respect one thing, and that is strength. In the past, over a period of several centuries, Russia was rich and weak, and Russia was always beaten. He said, do you remember the line of the old poet who said, you are poor and abundant, mighty and impotent Mother Russia? And he said it was known to foreign conquerors that Mother Russia was mighty, she was rich, and she was impotent. She could be beaten with impunity, and she could, of course, be looted with impunity. He said, but comrades, we do not want to be beaten. In the past, we had no fatherland. We could have had none at the time. But now that we have overthrown capitalism and the power is in our hands, in the hands of the people, we have a fatherland, and we will uphold its independence. Do you want our socialist fatherland to be beaten and to lose its independence? If you do not want this, you must put an end to its backwardness in the shortest possible time and develop a genuine Bolshevik tempo in building up its socialist economy. There's no other way. That's why Lenin said on the eve of the October Revolution, either perish or overtake and outstrip the advanced capitalist countries. And Stalin goes on to say, and this is really important for you to listen to, we are 50 or 100 years behind advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall go under. This was 1931. Exactly 10 years later, the Nazis attacked. And had the Soviet Union not been involved in gigantic schemes of socialist construction, had she not building up her industry, science and technology, had she not collectivized agriculture, there's no chance that the Soviet Union could ever have won that war. The third factor in the victory of the Soviet Union was the was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Communist Party was a cementing force that actually made everything cohesive, that gelled various sections of society, that led the masses of people in both socialist construction and collectivization, but also in fighting against foreign imperialism. People knew what they were fighting. People had a focus, and that focus was provided by leadership. Without leadership, no victory can ever be won. And the Soviet Union was victorious because it was led by a party which had as glorious a history and tradition as the Bolshevik party built by Lenin. The fourth factor was the USSR. It was a very, very novel experience in the history of the world. People from several nationalities, dozens of them, people with various religious backgrounds, people with various colors of skin, people with literally dozens of languages living together as one family. We are told in imperialist countries, foreigners are a problem. The arrival of a single foreigner is a misfortune for this country. But the Soviet Union incorporated all the peoples that formed part of the former Tsarist empire. And for the first time, these people lived a happy, equal, and fraternal life. They loved each other because nobody was out to exploit the others. Each nation loved the others because no nation was wanting to exploit. Unlike the colonial relationship which dominant imperialist and capitalist powers established with other non-dominant nations, the Soviet Union, with Russia being the largest nation and being the richest region, transferred huge amounts of resources, material, financial, technological, and scientific, to the formerly colonized people, and brought them up to a standard. For the first time, people in these republics began to use their own languages for their own administration, for their education, in schools and in everyday life. Even some of their old religious places, which were going into ruin because they had some historic significance, were actually rebuilt. Not to propagate religion, but these were achievements of craftsmen in the past centuries that needed to be preserved. You wouldn't have to be a devout Christian if somehow St. Paul's was going into rack and ruin, a communist regime actually conducted its repairs. That would be the normal thing, because that is the heritage of humanity, not the religious claptrap part of it, but the architecture and the whole building and historical development. So in the Second World War, as indeed during the Battle of Stalingrad, if the Russians, the Belarusians, the Baltics, the Kyrgyzs, Turkmenians, and various other people hadn't fought, and the Georgians, of course, hadn't fought shoulder to shoulder with each other, there's no question of there being any victory, either during the wider Second World War or the Battle of Stalingrad. And finally, I have to add this. I don't think there is any hostile element here, but there are elsewhere. The very important role played by Joseph Stalin in that victory. Yes, he was only an individual, but individuals do acquire certain importance. Individuals sometimes become, through their identification with a particular class and its interests, become representative spokesmen for that particular class. And nobody represented the Soviet working class after the death of Lenin as much as Stalin did. And nobody actually represented the international working class movement as much as Stalin did. So the role that he played in that victory is of enormous significance, and I shall have more to say on that. Having given this general opening remark, because I thought it should not be lost in the translation somehow, I can now get on with the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 200 days. And it's referred to in the Soviet Union as, or was referred to in the old Soviet Union as 200 days of fire. It lasted from 17th of July 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943, when at 1600 hours on the 2nd of February 1943, the guns fell silent with the capture of von Paulus the previous day and 24 other generals. Never has the world ever witnessed a spectacle of 25 generals, including a field marshal, being captured and brought to be questioned by the Soviet generals. Now, anybody who tells you communism is a failed system, Marxism and Leninism is a failed system, they ought to remember the achievements of communism, the comparable to which you cannot find anywhere in the world. It was not a victory of the Soviet Union and the Soviet people. It was a victory of entire progressive humanity, of which everyone, somebody living in a little village in Rwanda, Burundi, to somebody living in Britain, to somebody in the former Soviet Union, can be justly proud, unless they're hardened reactionaries, of course, who hate the fact that the Soviet Union was victorious in this struggle. The victory at Stalingrad, as indeed the triumphal outcome of the entire great patriotic war, was an eloquent testimony to the invincibility of the socialist social and state system, the socio-political and ideological unity of Soviet society, the fraternal bonds of solidarity of the Soviet people, their boundless devotion to the ideals of communism, and their love and respect for and devotion to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the party of Lenin and Stalin. This battle, and indeed the whole war, proved the correctness of Lenin's penetrating observation that in any war, victory is ultimately decided by the spiritual state of the masses who shed their blood on the battlefield. And in response to the party's appeal, all the Soviet people rose to defend Stalingrad, the freedom and honor of the USSR, and the fruits of the October Revolution. At the beginning of the war, Stalin had clearly stated what the Soviet Union was fighting for. And those of you who have been to South Hall and attended our celebration of the October Revolution for the past couple of years would have listened to Stalin's speech. This is what Stalin said, addressing the gathered troops who were out to go to the front in Red Square, and they're marking, of course, the October Revolution anniversary. The Nazis are at the gates of Moscow. They're not very far from Moscow, and they were hoping to capture Moscow and eliminate the Soviet Union from the face of the earth. And during these dangerous times when everybody would have wanted Moscow to be evacuated, certainly if it was London, the first ones to be evacuated would be the high government officials, the ministers, the rich, and everybody else. It'll be the Ivor Kenners and Flo Kenners of the world who would be, who would be left here to fend for themselves and say, you know, God take care of you, and everybody else leaves. But Stalin insisted that the Soviet capital will not be evacuated, and the October Revolution's anniversary would be marked as it had been ever since the establishment of the Soviet Union, including the difficult days of the Civil War, when actually 3/4 of Soviet territory was occupied by foreigners, which never happened during the Second World War. He said, "Comrades, men of the Red Army and Red Navy, comrades and political instructors, men and women guerrillas, and the whole world is looking to you as the forces capable of destroying the plundering hordes of German invaders. The enslaved peoples of Europe who have fallen under the yoke of German invaders look to you as their liberators. A great liberating mission has fallen to your lot. Be worthy of this mission. The war you are waging is a war of liberation, a just war. Let the manly images of our great ancestors, Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kazuma Minin, Dmitry Pozharsky, Alexander Suvorov, and Mikhail Kutsov inspire you in this war. May the victorious banner of the great Lenin be your lodestar." Now, this really inspired the Soviet soldier and the Soviet people. Even Isaac Deutscher has to say that it lifted the spirits of the Soviet people in a way nothing could have done or nothing would have done. And the Soviet people went to fight in the war. Those who will tell you the Soviet regime was unpopular, that the peasantry was sullen, that people hated Stalin. Well, if they hated Stalin, it's a very funny way of showing. They went to the war in their millions with what on their lips? For the motherland and for Comrade Stalin. Now, that's the truth that I'm not making up. So people don't die saying with George Bush on their lips, right? They do not do that. They did that because they knew the Soviet leadership was at one with people, and it had the interests of the people at heart, and precisely why they fought. The peoples of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic republics, the Caucasus and Siberia, Kazakhstan and Central Asia fought together. Had they not fought together, Stalingrad would not be the name of the glorious victory that it actually was to become and has remained so. Soviet Union, you have to remember, and this is very important, is at the time having to fight in the absence of a second front. Early in 1941, Molotov in London had agreed with the British government that there would be a second front. Later on, there was a meeting between Harriman, who was representing President Roosevelt of the United States, and Churchill and Stalin in Moscow, and they asked for the second front to be open. By that time, of course, Churchill said we'd never promised to open a second front in 1941. And Averell Harriman obviously supported Churchill because this was preconceived. The idea still was the Soviet Union should exhaust herself fighting on her own against the Nazis. And the result, of course, was that Nazis were hardly keeping 20% of their forces on the Western Front. All their forces, 178 divisions, had been taken to the Eastern Front to fight against the Soviet Union. Now, had the Second Front been open, the Nazis couldn't maintain so many forces on the Eastern Front. And the idea is that the Soviet Union would not come through, would not pull through the Battle of Stalingrad. Soviet Union, as we would find out, was to pull through, as you already know, was to pull through the Battle of Stalingrad and come out victorious out of this horrendous conflict. Then there was a conference of the Big Three in Tehran. It was for the first time, because of her glorious victory at Stalingrad, for the first time, Soviet Union became one of the Big Three. The United States, Britain, and Soviet Union. Actually, one of two and a half. Because the United States and Britain were, United States and the Soviet Union emerged very powerful. Britain was on the way down, and Churchill knew all the time. He was small, and he looked very small when he was sitting with Stalin and Roosevelt. He constantly had to watch that deals were not done over his head. He was constantly frightened, and it's at that time, of course, that Churchill, with his typical hypocrisy, takes a jeweled sword from King George V and presents it to Stalin, for, in honor of the victory at Stalingrad. So, in the absence of the Second Front, the Soviet Union was forced to wage an unequal battle single-handedly against the hordes of the fascist bloc, which enabled the Hitlerites to gather additional forces for an offensive on the Soviet-German front, without fearing for the safety of Germany's rear. And on the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad depended the question of whether Japan and Turkey would join the Second World War on the side of the Hitlerites. They were watching. If the Soviet Union had been beaten, they would have jumped to join, but actually that never happened. First of all, the Soviet Union, those of you who read Lalkar would have read an excellent article recently on the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. Very few people know anything about the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. It was on the Manchurian borders, where the Japanese had attacked the Soviet Union, and battle took place around Lake Hassan. And General Zhukov at that time was in charge of that battle. They gave such a good drumming to the Japanese. The Japanese thought very, very hard before they would join the war, and so they didn't. The Nazis, having been beaten at the Battle for Moscow during the winter of 41-42, and unable to wage an offensive simultaneously in all strategic directions of the German-Soviet front, then decided in the summer of 1942 to concentrate all the available forces to them on the southern wing of the front, with the intention of smashing Soviet troops west of the Don before seizing the Caucasian oil fields and passes through the Caucasian mountain chains, deprive the USSR of the Caucasian oil and Donetsk and Stalingrad industry, thereby weaken the Soviet Union and set the stage for its final destruction. In the spring of 42, in May, the Soviet active forces, that's throughout, included 5.5 million men, 57,500 guns and mortars, and 5,000 tanks and 2,480 aircraft. At the same time, the Nazis and their allies had 6.2 million men, 3,230 panzers and self-propelled guns, 57,000 guns and mortars, and nearly 3,400 fighters. It might look a bit balanced, but actually the Germans had more forces because as they beat in various countries, they gathered the forces of their allies, the subjugated peoples. They acquired, of course, the material resources of the countries they had already occupied as well. And the German forces were numerically superior as much as they were superior in armaments as well at that time. And it's remarkable how between the spring of 1942 and the winter of 42, the Soviet Union is able to so increase its production of armaments and the quality of its armaments that by the time the final stages of the Battle of Stalingrad begin, with the Soviet counteroffensive that began on the 19th of November 1942, that actually Soviet Union enjoyed superiority over German armaments. It was producing the guns that were the joy of the Red Army men, but the terror of the Nazi panzers. It was producing the aircraft which beat the German aircraft in every way. And those of the liars and falsifiers of history who tell you Soviet Union had nothing to fight with because Stalin had neglected everything are talking out of their hats, through their hats, if you like, because this is not true. Soviet Union was a bit behind Germany. So you have to remember where Soviet Union has come from. Backward Tsarist Russia. The industrialization does not begin till 29. The collectivization does not begin till 1928. And in a period, really, from 28, if you like, from 1928 to 41, you have got 13 years. The Soviet Union has to play the catch-up game in a period of just over a decade. So Soviet Union was inferior, if you like. The other thing was Soviet Union was trying to avoid the war for as long as she possibly could. A war that she could not in the end avoid, but she tried to delay the war as much as possible. And the Soviet-German non-aggression pact did precisely that. It delayed the war by 2 years. But the Soviet Union's hope and expectation was that the war would be delayed by another year. Now, you can call it Stalin's mistake. You can call it Stalin's crime, if you like, that France crumbled so quickly. The French were supposed to be the most powerful armed nation on the continent of Europe, with their Maginot Line and everything. And when they were attacked by the Hitlerites, they lasted 2 weeks. And the British were dispatched after the Dunkirk spirit from the continent of Europe. So Hitler suddenly found himself to be the master of the continent of Europe. He had to decide that time whether to attack Britain or to attack the Soviet Union. Well, he chose Soviet Union. He chose Soviet Union for double reasons. Soviet Union had larger resources which could be looted with impunity. And the second reason was that they hated communism. They've always wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. And the third reason was Nazis, as indeed all other imperialists, were actually victims of their own propaganda. They believed that the Soviet Union was a soft target. It was easy, it was a pushover, she could be pushed into a corner and beaten within a matter of 6 weeks. That's what the Hitlerites had expected, but that's not what happened. So in the spring of 1942, Soviet troops suffered a number of reversals, and the strategic initiative after the Battle of Moscow once again returned to the Nazis, who had managed to concentrate 90 divisions and several brigades on the southern wing of the Soviet-German front. And by the first half of July 1942, German plans to break through to the Volga and take Stalingrad became all too clear. Before that, it wasn't clear whether the Germans would come back again towards Leningrad and Moscow or would go to Stalingrad. And there was a lot of discussion between Stalin and his generals as to what were the German intentions. But anyway, by July it becomes clear that it is Stalingrad that the Nazis are hoping to reach and beat the Soviet Union at. Basically, if they had won the Battle of Stalingrad, it would have deprived the Soviet Union of all the oil that came from the Caucasus. Secondly, it would have meant that there would be no communication between the North and the South. It would be cut that communication would be cut. The country would simply be cut into two halves. So it was really decided that Stalingrad's geographical, economic, and political significance was such that it was imperative that it be defended at all costs. For the loss of this strategic point and a major industrial center would cut communications between the central regions and the Caucasus. Thus, in July, the center of operations on the Soviet front had shifted southwards from Moscow, and the future course of the Great Patriotic War depended largely on the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad. The legendary Battle of Stalingrad, to repeat, lasted 6.5 months, 200 days. It involved over 2 million men, 26,000 guns and mortars, over 2,000 tanks, and approximately 2,000 aircraft. This battle can be divided into two distinct periods. First, the defensive period, between 17th of July to 18th of November, on the approaches to Stalingrad and Stalingrad itself. And the second one is the offensive period, which begins on the 19th of November 1942 to the final victory of the Soviet forces on the 2nd of February. During this period, Joseph Stalin is appointed the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Now, Khrushchev in his secret speech said Stalin knew nothing about war. He ran away from Moscow, and he only fought war on the globe and had no contact with the troops. But somebody who actually helped Khrushchev stay in power, somebody who helped Khrushchev a great deal, after the 20th Party Congress, namely General Zhukov, in his memoirs says, people have often asked me the question, where was Stalin during those fateful days? He said, I answer that he was here in Moscow planning troop concentrations, the reserves for the general headquarters, and making sure that the materials reached where they were needed, and coordinating the role of various armies. He says, and in fact, it's everybody's assertion, and it's a true assertion, from Gorbachev to Zhukov, he made harsh demands on his generals and his countrymen. He made harsh demands on himself and expected the same of others. And even Gorbachev, who hated Stalin so much, and whose job was as a last in the line of Khrushchevites to bring the Soviet Union to end, he said the role played by Stalin and his strict leadership was very important in winning the Second World War. And his, of course, the chief representative in the armed forces was General Vasilev. Now, the chief of General Staff, Vasilevsky, or in his absence, his first deputy Voronov, were required to make, and this is the contact that Stalin maintains, required to make 2 reports to Stalin from the war front every day. One at noontime, which will actually inform him of all that had happened in the last 12 hours and during the night, and one about 9 or 10 in the evening. The one during the day was by telephone, and one in the evening was in person. One of the generals would travel to the Kremlin and actually give a report. And he had some rather unsocial hours of working. 4 o'clock, his general would be there. He said, you're tired. A little refreshment wouldn't hurt. You have some dinner with me, you know. So he'll discuss this. He will know exactly what was to be done. And it wasn't until 4 o'clock that he went to sleep, got up about 8:30, 9, and pored over all the reports that had come. So he was constantly in touch with the fronts in every possible way. At 1800 hours on August the 23rd, the Nazis unleashed the massed air raid on Stalingrad. From the very outset, Stalingrad tractor works came under enemy's crushing artillery and mortar assault. Stalingrad, however, as one of the Soviet generals said, Stalingrad, however, was remarkable not only for the terrible destruction. I witnessed here the unflinching courage of the Soviet people, both military and civilian, and their ability to resist the enemy in the face of the most incredible hardships. continues Marshal Yeryomenko, who actually was in charge of the Soviet troops in Stalingrad itself, where they were involved in the end in house to house and street to street and one factory to another building fighting, hand-to-hand fighting. He continues, the enemy was counting on panic. He wanted to introduce confusion in our ranks, paralyze the leadership, crush the will of the defenders of Stalingrad, and become the master of the situation. The assailants believed their victory to be close, but this was a fatal miscalculation. And soon, very soon, they began to realize their mistake at their own expense. Ivor Kenna introduced me to that book, which I bought. There's an Austrian professor called Topich. He's very right-wing, semi-fascistic. He didn't like the fact that Germany was beaten in the Second World War, but he's very truthful about historical facts. And he compares, first of all, the leadership of Hitler and Stalin. He said their relationship might be compared to that of a gambler and a chess master. Stalin knew exactly how to move his pieces. He didn't gamble on anything. He planned everything. And he then says that when the German forces entered the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, every one of the invaders, and along with that their high command and Hitler, must have realized that they had come into an unknown territory. They had opened a door behind which Stalin had some wicked surprises for them. And sure enough, the Soviet Union did have some wicked surprises. On the same day that the Nazis launched an attack, and this is really the strength of the Soviet Union, it had such internationalist connections. There were many Soviet generals who had fought during the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side. And of course, once the Republicans were beaten, there were plenty of Republicans who joined the Soviet forces. And I'd just like to mention one such soldier, and his name was Ruben Ruiz Ibarruri, son of the famous La Pasionaria. He was in charge of a regiment, and he was trying to inspire his troops when he actually was hit by a German bullet and died in that battle, and was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. So there were a lot of people from many other countries, people who had been persecuted by fascism, who actually fought with the Soviet armed forces. This battle that started by the Germans, the Messe bombing on 23rd of August. So the battle carried on, the savage fighting carried on for over a month over the area of Greater Stalingrad. And by mid-October, the two sides were contending Stalingrad's factories under bombardment by over 1,000 planes, supported by 150 tanks and infantry. Stalingrad tractor works passed into the enemy's hands. It was the pride of the Soviet Union, the tractor works at Stalingrad. And to actually have them pass to the fascists was a heart-wrenching thing. But the Soviet people did not give up their fight and resistance. They did not lose heart. Most of the Soviet soldiers and officers defending the works perished in the battle, having performed their sacred duty honorably without retreating an inch. Having taken over the tractor works, the Nazis made repeated attempts to exploit their success. But all their endeavors were of no avail, as the Soviet forces, though substantially depleted, hung on and managed to regroup in the course of the battle and check the Nazi advance. In late October, the Nazi forces intensified their attacks, but the Soviet soldiers did not desert their line. On 29th of October, this is something you only recently seen repeated in the Gaza Strip by the Israeli valiant forces, if you like. On 29th of October, the Soviet forces repulsed 14 Nazi attacks. In the last of these attacks, the Germans took cover behind civilian population, driving women and children ahead. And says Colonel General Lyudnikov, he says, "We had seen many Nazi criminal acts in this war, but this was the first time we had come across such brutality and cowardice, the German soldiers hiding behind women's backs." But all this is taking place, and the resistance is taking place because of the titanic work of the Communist Party and the efforts of the entire Soviet people living under socialism. Refiguring of the national economy to the war orientation, culminated by the end of 1942 in the development of a new powerful war industry in the eastern regions of the country. Remember, once Soviet Union is attacked, 2,000 major industrial works had to be transferred to the eastern part of the country. It's a mammoth operation. It's not taking machines and spare parts. It is also taking the workers and their families and everybody there. And this is a time when 80 million of Soviet people are in areas which are occupied by the Nazis. So it's a very, very difficult job to perform, but the Soviet Union did that. In the autumn of 42, the output of armaments and munitions grew with each passing month, thus making good the depletion of armaments, ammunition, and material resources during the spring and summer operations. Now come to the counteroffensive, the offensive section of the war. At a meeting dated the 13th of September 1942 between Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky, the counteroffensive was planned. It was to be a big secret operation, and Stalin had given strict instruction to Zhukov and to Vasilevsky not to tell anybody, including the commanders and the generals who were to be in charge of this fighting. They were to go to various areas, talk to the commanders, talk to the generals, have conferences on the front, gauge their emotions, gauge their feelings, tell them that we will do something, but nobody was to tell them precisely what was to take place. Nobody was to tell them what the 0 hour was when the offensive would start, and it was kept. And the movement of Soviet troops was such that the Nazis had difficulty discovering that the Soviet Union was planning anything. Owing to the secrecy and precautions taken by the Soviet side, the Nazi command failed to discover in time the concentration of Soviet troops and the force and the location of Soviet shock groupings and directions of the Soviet forces' chief blows, let alone the counteroffensive 0 hour. The crushing blows which visited disaster on the German army in November took the Nazi leadership completely by surprise. The strategic plan to deliver a mortal blow to the Nazi army near Stalingrad emerged and matured during the defensive battles. So while the defensive battles are going on, the Soviet Union is actually planning the counteroffensive as well. The operational plan and its brilliant fulfillment was proof of the rapid strengthening of the Soviet armed forces by the winter of 42-43, their increased fighting capacity, and the organizational improvement. In analyzing and singling out the reasons for Soviet triumph, we must not ignore the role played by Soviet military science and military commanders. So commanders fought at the front, but there are people working behind the scenes. These are Soviet scientists. These are engineers. These are collective farm workers who are producing the food. These are people who are improving aircraft and delivering aircraft. I mean, there comes a time when the Soviet pilots say, we could actually do more. We could fly more sorties. We could defeat the Germans better if our planes were lighter. So the officers themselves, the pilots themselves look into how to make the planes light. They said, we got night vision equipment in the planes, but we're not flying at night, so dump that. We have this kind of gear for certain weather conditions. That weather condition is not there. We don't need to do that. And so we could make up planes lighter by half a ton. So to make the planes lighter by half a ton, you've got to go back to the factory and ask the engineers, how do you make them lighter? And when they explain these problems to the engineers not only approve of them, but also suggest other ways of making the planes better. So there's a constant intercourse, there's a constant connection and rapport between the people, the engineers working in the factories, and the commanders and the pilots who are flying the planes and conducting the war effort. So Soviet science played a tremendous role and came up with everything that was necessary. One of the things that one has to remember is how to go from a defensive to an offensive, and how to go from numerical inferiority to superiority. Now, in the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviet forces were balanced equally with the Nazis. They did not have the numerical superiority. But what they could do was, in the areas where they were to strike their main blows, they could concentrate their forces and achieve a numerical superiority. So you have the advantage of having that superiority where you want to strike, although you don't have it all across the front. Although the forces on both sides of the Stalingrad front appeared to be equal, in areas where the chief assaults were to be launched, the Soviet forces had powerful shock groups with sufficient numerical superiority to enable them to be sure of absolute success. This had been accomplished by transferring major resources from general headquarters and at the expense of weakening considerably sectors of secondary importance. Now, general headquarters, and Stalin was the supreme commander-in-chief, and there was the State Defense Committee, which he also headed, had number of armies and forces in the reserve. They were not on every front. They were sent to where they were needed, and it was the beauty of that system that they could send them where they were needed. And when Stalingrad was in difficulty, then these forces were transferred, and they did a wonderful job. Despite all the difficulties, the necessary concentration of troops and resources was being accomplished with hardly any deviations from the schedule. When they decide that the battle has to start on a certain day, Stalin insists that it start on that day. But the generals sometimes come and say, no, we got to start a week later. And they, through a haggling with each other, they say, okay, we can delay it by 4 days. Okay, let's delay it by 4 days. And they agree on the date, and then that date is abided by. The Soviet troops who had been initiated into the plan by word of mouth, nothing by communication. Stalin was very keen that telephone be not used too often, particularly at a time when they could not scramble the telephone conversation so that the Nazis could come to know of it. As little of it as possible, and the conversation should be of such a nature that the enemy didn't get much out of it. So the plan was that the offensive would start on the 19th of November. The first assault would be by the troops of the Southwest Front, and the following day it will be the Stalingrad Front. And literally within 4 days of the fighting, they had encircled a whole German army that was occupying the parts of Stalingrad and parts of the wider Stalingrad area. During the 21st and 22nd of November, having started the offensive on the 19th and 20th, the southwestern Stalingrad and Don fronts inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, penetrated deep into the rear of his main body, and disorganized enemy troop control, and carrying out the Supreme Command's mission. By 23rd of November, 3 Soviet fronts, having skillfully delivered the blows converging upon a place called Kalach, C-A-L-A-C-H, completed the encirclement of Nazi grouping operating in the Stalingrad area. With this, the first and the most crucial stage of the operation was brilliantly fulfilled, whereupon the strategic initiative returned once again to the Soviet forces. So, having encircled the Germans, and incidentally, this is very important. This was to prove a very difficult job. You've encircled them, but how do you exterminate them? Because at that time, the Soviet Union had, because of poor intelligence, thought there were 90,000 German troops encircled. They were later on to find out there were 330,000. Not only were they encircled, but they were fighting fiercely. They were not giving up. The next job was to defeat the encircled troops as quickly as possible. Now this, as I said, proved a harder task than anticipated because the Soviet forces had underestimated the strength of the encircled enemy. In early December, the number of Soviet troops on the inner encirclement front amounted to 300,000. But they were to discover that the Germans they were facing, albeit encircled, were 330,000. So even if they're encircled, they have some armament. They can't just be told to come and have a cup of tea and we'll talk about it later. They were not giving up. They were also infected by fascist Nazi ideology, which regarded themselves as invincible, which regarded the Soviets as Slav people, as inferior people who could be disposed of in no time. So they were not giving up. What's more, the Germans relied on their network of defensive installations carefully built by their engineers. They put up a fierce resistance, retaliating with counteroffensive attacks against each of the Soviet advances. During the 7 days of fighting, beginning from 19th of November, nearly 7,000 enemy officers and men had been taken prisoner, and a great deal of weapons and equipment captured. Still, the Nazis continued to resist fiercely. So the question is, what was the cause of it? Interrogation of German prisoners revealed that the encircled German troops were losing confidence in Hitler and had begun to sense doom. You'd be silly not to. The text of then what the Soviet Union did was it presented them with an ultimatum on the 7th and 8th of January. You capitulate, otherwise you'll be destroyed. And this was demoralizing the German troops. But what happened was then there was a pressure by the German officers to intimidate them. And they came, and Paulus issued an order, which, with a view to convincing the German soldiers, you might as well fight and die. Because if you don't, you're either going to live in humiliating captivity of the Soviet Union, or alternatively, they'll come and put a bullet in your head. So that is what they were taught. There was no idea that the Soviet Union would in any way treat them as prisoners of war in a humane fashion, as was the practice of the Soviet Union. Whatever Mr. Anthony Beaver might tell you, the fact of the matter is Soviet Union did not treat the defeated Nazis in the same way as the Nazis did their captured Soviet soldiers. They tortured them, they killed them, they humiliated them. They took hundreds of thousands of them to put in their slave factories in Germany to work in industrial enterprises, just as they'd done various other captured people, communists, Jews, anybody else they could find of that they regarded as being inferior. As they continued to fight, on the 12th of December, the Nazi command formed a new army called the Dawn Group, headed by Field Marshal General Manstein. And they attempted to actually rescue the 6th German Army, which was encircled by the Soviet troops. But the Soviet Union beat this attempt completely, not just the land forces, but also the air force. And the Soviet Union wanted to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. So they issued this ultimatum on the 7th and 8th of January. And when they got a negative response from the German High Command, on the 10th of January, the Soviet Union launched what is known as Operation Ring, which was to actually go and destroy the encircled German troops. Now, by this time, not only Soviet Air Force, but Soviet artillery had become very powerful indeed. I mean, insofar as it is possible to admire armaments of war, Soviet Union had achieved most perfect for the times type of artillery. And the Soviet generals describe in eloquent terms how one felt pleased when this artillery was launched on the German forces. And after an hours of artillery bombardment and having plowed the German position, then, of course, the infantry and the tank divisions would move and mop up the Germans. So, after the ultimatum has been declined or rejected by the German High Command, at 5 minutes past 8 o'clock in the morning of January the 10th, the Soviet command issued the order, fire, over the radio, followed by the deafening roar of 7,000 guns and mortars. You know the famous Katyusha rockets? which were invented during that period of time. It was also popularly known as Stalin's organ. Because if you look at its shape, it looks like a church organ. It's got pipes. It's a multi-rail rocket. The earth shook on enemy ground and leveled the enemy groups' airfields and kept enemy planes grounded. So it went on for 55 minutes without a single retaliatory shot coming from the enemy. This was followed by an attack by the infantry and tanks. The light 76 mm gun was the favorite of the Soviet gunners and the terror of the Nazi panzers. Time after time, Soviet aircraft flew overhead. The enemy defense had been successfully breached to a depth of 6 to 8 kilometers. By the evening of January the 12th, Soviet forces had reached the river Rososhka and the vicinity of Karpovka. Heavy losses were inflicted on the enemy's manpower, artillery, and equipment, and his morale was thoroughly shaken. And now, on January the 31st, Paulus was taken prisoner along with 24 other generals. As I said before, and I say it again because I like repeating it. And, the world has never known a spectacle before or since of such a large number of high-ranking officials being captured. I mean, apart from these 25 generals, 2,500 other ranks of officers were captured. And of course, there were 100,000 ordinary soldiers. Marshal Paulus was summoned before General Rokossovsky and General Voronov for questioning. And as he comes there on the evening of 1st of February, that's one day after his capture, he is asked to give orders to his troops to cease firing. That's one day before the war, the Battle of Stalingrad ends. And he says he can't do it. Why not? I'm a prisoner now. Our forces have a new commander. He is the only one who can give order. I can't give an order. He stuck to the last, and he won't give the order. Later on, if I have the time, perhaps during question hours, I'd like to give you some glimpses of the interrogation of Paulus. It actually shows you the kind of humane treatment of such vicious enemies that the Soviet side actually treats them with. It's most remarkable. So Paulus, when he refused to tell his troops to cease fire, although they would have obeyed him, he might be in captivity, but he was the field marshal. He kept on being promoted because, for weeks he was asking Hitler for permission to withdraw from the Stalingrad area. He had come to realize, because he was there on the battlefield, that the Germans could not win that. So he kept on asking for permission, and Hitler kept on saying no, and sending him another promotion. So he became a field marshal, almost, because the Germans were losing the battle, and he wanted to stick it out. I mean, the one of the things is that Hitlerites had become obsessed with Stalingrad. Some of this obsession was legitimate because control of Stalingrad would mean the control of a very strategic place, industrially important from the point of view of fuel supplies, important from the point of view of its industry, but also because its name was associated with Stalin. And they wanted to really do nothing better than do down poor old Joseph Vassarianovich. And I'm not surprised that at the end of the war, when the Soviet troops reached Berlin and the Führer committed suicide as the red flag is being hoisted on the Reichstag, his last words to his advisors was he was committing suicide because he didn't want to be captured and hanged in the Kremlin and hung out outside Stalin's office to dry. Because they obviously had very good reasons to feel that is probably what will happen.
That's what they deserved.
Yeah. So Paulus refusing to order his men to cease fire, the Soviet forces renewed their offensive on the 2nd of February. The powerful Soviet artillery shook the ground. After preparatory bombardment, Soviet infantry and tanks went into attack. Suddenly, white flags went up in droves in the enemy ranks, one after the other. The enemy ceased resisting, bringing an end to the last of German resistance at Stalingrad, with 35,000 Germans taken prisoners straight away. At 1600 hour on 2nd of February, a dispatch was sent to Moscow saying that the Don Front had completed routing the encircled enemy group. A territorial area of 1,400 square kilometers had been cleared of the enemy. Over 91,000 men had been taken prisoner, including 2,500 officers and 24 generals, thus bringing to a victorious end the titanic and epoch-making Battle of Stalingrad on the banks of the mighty river Volga. Early on the morning of 14th, says Voronov, General Rokossovsky and I left for Moscow in an aircraft piloted personally by Alexander Glovanov. He was in charge of one of the air armies. Everyone deeply in his own thoughts. The Battle of Stalingrad marked an important stage in the development of Soviet art of war and growth in military skill of all arms commanders. Soviet command had successfully planned and carried out a large-scale area. During the Battle of Stalingrad, the fascist bloc countries lost 1/4 of their forces operating on the Soviet-German front. These losses, totaling 1.5 million men and officers killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, had a devastating effect on Nazi Germany. The rout of the Romanian and Italian forces could not but affect the domestic situation in these countries. The allies of Germany started seeking favorable ways out of the war. The disaster that befell Nazi Germany at Stalingrad put paid once and for all to Japan and Germany's desire to join the war on German side in the event of the fall of Stalingrad. The Nazi defeat at Stalingrad was a political, military, and moral defeat that smashed mad Nazi plans and dreams of enslaving the Soviet Union, and exploded the myth of German military invincibility. It changed the course of the entire war. Indeed, it changed the course of world history. It was doubtless one of the most glorious episodes in the history of the great patriotic war of the Soviet people and world history. The Battle of Stalingrad saved hundreds of millions of people from the jackboot of Nazi occupation and enslavement. Soviet soldier and civilian, filled with patriotism and the devotion to the Communist Party, showing staunchness in defense and vehemence in attack, fought shoulder to shoulder. There was the highest of cooperation between the front and the rear, between soldiers and factory and farm workers. There is one other thing that I'd like to definitely deal with, if you would allow me. Chairman, have I got another 5 minutes or so?
Yes, please.
And there's a lot more material that I would probably use if you have any questions to ask, or perhaps during the discussion. But there is something that I definitely want to do, and most of this evidence comes from hostile sources, so it's much more easily believed by people than if it came from, say, Kaganovich or Proskrebiev or somebody like that. And that is the role of Stalin, who, according to Khrushchev, played no role. He went into hiding, and he was not to be seen in Moscow, where he was. Nobody could find him. And in the end, probably the gallant Khrushchev discovered him and saying, "It's all right. It's not so bad. Come on, we can fight it out." And this is what Gorbachev has to say about Stalin. A factor in the achievement of victory, and this is Gorbachev really saying, speaking at the festive meeting on the 70th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. So he's speaking in 1987. He says a factor in the achievement of victory was the tremendous political will, purposefulness, and persistence, ability to organize and discipline people displayed in the war years by Joseph Stalin. Now, he hated Stalin. I mean, this would have been very difficult for him to pronounce these words, but nevertheless, he did that. Ian Gray is an American historian. He's written a book. If you ever get a chance to, you can get it from the Amazon. It's called Man of Destiny. These books, Man of History, Man of History. It's a very good book, and these books are not read by people who go to W.H. Smith's. So it is available. You can get hold of it, and it's worthwhile. You can't easily put it down. It's so good. He says the massive setbacks and immediate threat to Moscow would have unnerved most men, but the impact of Stalin was to strengthen his grim determination to fight. No single factor was more important in holding the nation from disintegration at this time than Stalin. And further, Ian Gray says, it was in a real sense his victory. That's the Second World War. It could not have been won without his industrialization campaign, and especially the intensive development of industry beyond the Volga. Collectivization had contributed to the victory by enabling the government to stockpile food and raw materials to prevent paralysis in industry and famine in the towns. But also collectivization, with its machine tractor stations, had given the peasants their first training in the use of tractors and other machines. So they were technically equipped. They could master machinery more easily. If you've never driven a tractor, driving a tank is a bit difficult. But if you have driven a tractor, although it's not a straight transfer to driving tanks, it's easier because you can understand machinery, you can understand how things work. And citing Isaac Deutscher, who by no means is a friendly character as far as Stalin is concerned, he's the only Trotskyite writer that I know can be called honest. That's a contradiction in terms, Trotskyite honest writer. But Deutscher is, because Deutscher was a good scholar. I met him during my youthful days, and occasionally exchanged the odd pleasantries with him too. When he came up with he's written two famous biographies. One is of Trotsky. It's a trilogy. He loves Trotsky. He dotes on Trotsky. And notwithstanding the fact he dotes on Trotsky, Trotsky comes out as a much shrunken, shriveled, little, vengeful poser. And he's written also a biography of Stalin, whom he hates, and never misses an opportunity, even for a second, to describe as him dull, dim-witted, this and the other. And when you finish reading his biography of Stalin, Stalin becomes really larger than life. He becomes a figure of historic proportions, a giant of a man, if you like. And so, citing Isaac Deutscher, Ian Gray goes on to say, collective farming had been the peasants' preparatory school for mechanized warfare. That line is from Deutscher. And then Ian goes on to say, carrying on the old quotation, the earlier quotation, it was his victory too, because he had directed and controlled every branch of Russian operations throughout the war. The range and burden of his responsibilities were extraordinary. I think he's still quoting Deutscher, if I remember. The range and burden of his responsibilities were extraordinary. But day by day, without a break, for 4 years of the war, he exercised direct command of the Russian forces and control over supplies, war industries, and government policies, including foreign policy. Finally, the same writer says, it was his victory above all because it had been won by his genius and labors. Heroic in scale, the Russian people had looked to him for leadership, and he had not failed them. His speeches of 3rd of July and 6th of November 1941, which had steeled them for the trials of war, and his presence in Moscow during the great battle of the city, had demonstrated his will to victory. He inspired them and gave them positive direction. He had the capacity of attending to detail and keeping in mind the broad picture, and while remembering the past and immersed in the present, he was constantly looking ahead to the future. And Deutscher is obliged to say the following. Many Allied visitors who called at the Kremlin during the war were astonished to see on how many issues, great and small, military, political, diplomatic, Stalin personally took the final decision. He was, in fact, his own commander-in-chief, his own minister of defense, his own quartermaster, his own minister of supply, his own foreign minister, and even his own chef de protocol. The Stavka, that's the Red Army's general headquarters, was in his offices in the Kremlin, from his office desk in constant and direct touch, as I have indicated during my presentation. With commands of the various fronts, he watched and directed campaigns in the field. From his office desk too, he managed another stupendous operation, the evacuation of 1,360 plants and factories from Western Russia to the Ukraine and the Volga, the Urals and Siberia, the evacuation that involved not only machines and installations, but millions of workmen and their families. Between one function and the other, he bargained with, say, Beaverbrook. He was Churchill's representative. He was from the owner of Daily Express, by the way, who used to publish Trotsky's articles earlier on. But, he finds himself in this position now. Beaverbrook and Harriman over the quantities of aluminium or the caliber of rifles and anti-aircraft guns to be delivered to Russia by the Western Allies. Or he received leaders of the guerrillas from German-occupied territory and discussed with them raids to be carried out hundreds of miles behind the enemy's lines. At the height of the Battle of Moscow in December 1941, when the thunder of Hitler's guns hovered ominously over the streets of Moscow, he found time enough to start a subtle diplomatic game with the Polish General Sikorsky, who had come to conclude Russo-Polish treaty. He entertained them, that's the foreign envoys and visitors, usually late at night and in the small hours of the morning. After a day filled with military reports, operational decisions, economic instructions, and diplomatic haggling, he would at dawn pore over the latest dispatches from the Commissariat of Home Affairs, the NKVD. Thus he went on day after day throughout 4 years of hostilities, a prodigy of patience, tenacity, and vigilance, almost omnipresent, almost omniscient. And further, there's no doubt that he was their Soviet troops' real commander-in-chief. His leadership was by no means confined to taking of abstract strategic decisions at which civilian politicians may excel. The avid interest with which he studied the technical aspects of modern warfare, down to the minute detail, shows him to have been anything but a dilettante. He viewed the war primarily from the angle of logistics, to secure reserves of manpower and supplies of weapons in the right quantities and proportions, to allocate them and transport them to the right points at the right time, to amass a decisive strategic reserve, and to have it ready for intervention at decisive moments. These operations made up 9/10 of his task. This is how Deutscher paints the victory parade in Red Square at the end of the war. Anybody wants to see a picture of his? They can visit me sometimes, have a cup of tea with me or something else, and look at the picture. I've got it in my living room. Not the original, but a painting of it. Almost life-size. On 24th of June, 1945, Stalin stood at the top of the Lenin mausoleum and reviewed a great victory parade of the Red Army, which marked the 4th anniversary of Hitler's attack. By Stalin's side stood Marshal Zhukov, his deputy, the victor of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Berlin. The troops that marched past him were led by Marshal Rokossovsky, who was the leader of the Don Front, who, along with the Stalingrad front, had encircled the German troops. And the Don Front then went on to finish them off, if you like, in the Operation Ring. As they marched, rode, and galloped across Red Square, regiments of infantry, cavalry, and tanks swept the mud of the pavement. It was a day of torrential rain, with innumerable banners and standards of Hitler's army. At the mausoleum, they threw the banners at Stalin's feet. The allegorical scene was strangely imaginative. Deutscher says, the next day Stalin received the tribute of Moscow for the defense of the city in 1941. The day after, he was acclaimed as the hero of the Soviet Union and given the title of Generalissimo. In these days of undreamt triumph and glory, Stalin stood in the full blaze of popular recognition and gratitude. And this is very important. Every bourgeois will tell you, well, of course, the NKVD were there with rifles saying, you will applaud Stalin, won't you? These feelings were spontaneous, genuine, not engineered by official propagandists. Overworked slogans about the achievement of the Stalinist era now conveyed fresh meaning, not only to young people, but to skeptics and malcontents of the older generation. I think I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harpal. I'm sure all of you also want to thank Harpal. He's gone a very wide-sweeping speech, not just about Stalingrad, but the context in which that was set, and which people in this country have always forgotten so much about. They talk about the victory against fascism, but they don't understand how it was achieved and how the Soviet Union could achieve it. And the 5 points that Harpal referred to at the beginning give you a clear understanding of it, how Soviet power of itself is a thing that is so key to how these victories can be established. And there's no good arguing about which Soviet leader did it. It's the Soviet Party, which was led at that time by Stalin, that achieved these tremendous successes. And we have to make sure we're 100% understanding what Harpal has said. Now, I'm not criticising what he said. If you have any questions at all, want to get clarification on any other points or any other contributions, raise your hands.
Through days dark and stormy, while great Lenin led us, our eyes saw the bright sun of freedom above, and Stalin, our leader, with faith in the people, inspired us to build up the land that we love.